He wasn't executed. He wasn't poisoned. He was starved slowly, silently by the most powerful man in Eastern Europe, his own father. That is not folklore. That is documented imperial cruelty. But history didn't call it torture. It called it nervous failure, a harmless phrase, neat and sterile. As if a body reduced to bone and breathless silence could be explained by stress. As if a prince born to inherit an empire simply wasted away. But make no mistake, this was not a death. This was a deletion. The story you're about to hear isn't one of war or glory. It is one of psychological annihilation, a royal disappearance orchestrated behind closed doors, without trial, without blade, without blood. Only silence, only starvation. This is not a battlefield story, this is a prison story, and the prison was velvet-lined. In the early 1700s, a boy was born under cathedral bells and cannon fire, hailed as the future of Russia, the son of Peter the Great himself. But within the stone walls of palaces and convents, the very blood that crowned him began conspiring to erase him. He would not be killed swiftly. That would be merciful. Instead, he would be broken spirit first, then body, until the empire had no use for even his memory. Starvation in this case was not the result of famine. It was a weapon the most cowardly, the most efficient, the most deniable. There were no public decrees, no guards swinging axes, just a slow, calculated erosion of will, of hope, of resistance. A prince turned into a problem, then into a ghost. This story has been buried beneath state-approved biographies and dusty archival euphemisms. But if you listen closely past the gilded myths and military parades, you'll hear it the sound of one boy's ribs pressing against silk sheets, the sound of a crown being withheld like oxygen. You'll hear what happens when royalty isn't a blessing, but a death sentence. Heir to the most modernizing monarch Russia had ever seen, this boy was a symbol, too fragile, too dangerous, too misaligned with his father's vision. And so his life became a case study in royal suppression, his death a cautionary tale of what happens when obedience is not enough. He was punished not for what he did, but for what he represented. And in the end, it was not rebellion that killed him, but relevance. You're about to witness one of the darkest secrets in Russian history, the unraveling of a child from the inside out. His name was Alexei Petrovich, heir to the Russian Empire, and he would die not by sword, not by trial, but by silence. This is the true story of how a Tsar killed his own son without ever touching him. Before the starvation, before the interrogations, before the fortress swallowed his name, there was a wedding. Not one of love, not even one of alliance, but a calculated bond, a leash wrapped in silk meant to tether a wild reformer to an ancient church. Peter Alexeyevich Romanov, better known as Peter the Great, didn't choose his wife. She was chosen for him, not by passion, by policy. Her name was Eudoxia Lopukina, noble, devout, quiet. Everything Peter wanted Russia to stop being. She wore orthodoxy, like armor, obeyed with ritualistic precision, and bowed to traditions Peter had sworn to drag into the fire. Their union wasn't a bridge between worlds. It was a collision. Peter had vision, a Russia of steel ships, clean-shaven faces, and science over scripture. He shaved his beard publicly, defiantly, a symbolic severing from old Muscovy. Eudoxia was horrified. To her, it wasn't progress. It was heresy, a defilement of God's order. They spoke different languages, not of speech, but of purpose. Yet from this battlefield of values, a child was born. On March 28, 1690, in a blaze of imperial celebration, Alexei Petrovich entered the world. Cannons roared. Bishops blessed. Foreign emissaries bowed. The heir had arrived. But while the empire rejoiced, one man did not. Peter didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He barely acknowledged the birth. At just 18, the young Tsar already felt the weight of transformation pulling at his bones. He looked at the infant not with pride, but with suspicion. This boy was a product of a mistake, a child of the past conceived before Peter's rebirth as a modernizer. Alexei, from his first breath, was an echo of everything Peter was trying to destroy. The irony was suffocating the man. Dragging Russia into the Enlightenment had created a sun sculpted by shadows. The child didn't cry. He whimpered. And in that softness, Peter saw a threat. As Alexei grew, his nature betrayed him. He was quiet, studious, devoted to theology and texts. He recoiled from violence, flinched at raised voices, and wept during storms, traits revered in a monk, not in a monarch. At court, he stood like a ghost in brocade ornamental, uncertain, a symbol with no spine. Foreign ambassadors described him as melancholic and easily subdued. He avoided eye contact. He froze under pressure. He stammered in front of his father. To Peter, this wasn't shyness. It was weakness, disloyalty in slow motion. But where Peter saw failure, Eudoxia saw opportunity. Banished to a convent under the illusion of mercy, she was not erased. She evolved. She sent letters laced with scripture and sorrow, reminders that Alexei wasn't just a prince, he was a vessel, a spiritual heir to Holy Russia. She wrote not as a mother, but as a martyr. "Fear your father's teachings," she whispered from behind stone walls. "They are not the ways of the saints." And the boy listened. He drank in her words like absolution. Where Peter gave orders, Eudoxia gave meaning. Where Peter demanded obedience, she offered identity. Imagine being 10 years old, pulled between two worlds. One promises power through cruelty, the other salvation through submission. Which do you choose when both demand your soul? At the palace, Peter grew increasingly paranoid. He watched his son with the eyes of a man who believed rebellion begins in hesitation. He saw Alexei's kindness as betrayal, his caution as sabotage. "This boy," Peter said once to an ambassador, "will bury Russia in backwardness." Alexei heard those words, at 12, spoken not in anger but in cold imperial clarity. He began to learn that in this empire, survival was not inherited, it was performed. He smiled on cue. He bowed deeper. He memorized strategy manuals, quoted military scripture, endured the lashings of a father who claimed love by breaking bone. But inside, a fracture widened. He didn't want the crown. He feared it. Feared what it would require of him. Feared what it had done to his father. Behind closed doors, Alexei began to pray not for power but for escape. He whispered to icons. He clutched crosses like lifelines. He asked God not to make him czar. And yet, in his silence, he became even more dangerous. Because Peter wasn't afraid of rebellion. He was afraid of refusal. A son who wouldn't kill to rule couldn't be trusted to protect a throne built on conquest. So Peter acted. He ordered his men to spy on Alexei. Servants were paid to listen. Tutors were forced to report. Guards observed his posture, his pauses, his doubts. Love had become surveillance. Parenthood a state operation. Meanwhile, Eudoxia's network grew stronger. She was in contact with boyars, bishops, traditionalists who still dreamed of the true Russia of incense and autocracy. To them, Alexei wasn't weak. He was sacred. They whispered prophecies. They sang hymns of restoration. They carved dreams into the boy's mind until they became burdens. By the time he reached 17, Alexei was no longer a child. He was a contested artifact, a breathing contradiction. To Peter, he was a liability. To Eudoxia, a weapon. To himself, perhaps a shadow waiting for the world to forget him. But history never forgets. It buries, and then it whispers. And what it whispered in this case was that obedience would not save him. It would only delay the moment his blood was deemed inconvenient. There was no single moment where Alexei Petrovich lost his future. No rebellion, no outburst, no crime, just a slow, unrelenting erosion of trust, of identity, of place. He wasn't punished for what he did, he was punished for what he might do. Inside the palace, he moved like a ghost, trapped in daylight. The walls listened, the servants reported. Every word he spoke, every silence he held was interpreted not as thoughtfulness, but as threat. His father didn't need proof. He needed doubt. Peter the Great had survived wars, uprisings, plagues, but nothing terrified him more than his own bloodline turning soft. He saw in Alexei not a legacy, but a liability, and so he turned fatherhood into surveillance. One day, Peter summoned his son to observe a man being impaled not as punishment, but as instruction. The man screamed for minutes, skewered alive on a sharpened stake. Alexei could not breathe, could not look, but Peter did not blink. "This is what hesitation breeds," the Tsar said coldly. "You hesitate, you rot." Alexei did not answer. He couldn't. But deep inside, something cracked. A whisper began, one that would echo through every day to come. "I will never be like him." He began praying more, speaking less, smiling when told. He wore obedience like armor, but it never fit. The more he tried to disappear, the more Peter noticed. Because in an empire obsessed with control, even meekness is suspicious. His tutors became interrogators. His confessor reported on his sins. Guards were instructed to track his tone, not just his words. He once asked for a day of solitude. It was recorded as potential monastic retreat, a warning sign. He was not being raised. He was being managed. And in the shadows of his father's empire, his mother's voice returned. From her cell, Eudoxia continued to write, not to comfort, but to direct. Her letters praised martyrdom, mocked Western science, romanticized the old Russia Peter despised. "Your father fears your soul," she wrote, "because it cannot be colonized." To the boy, broken and watched, these words felt like air. For a moment he believed them, believed that perhaps he wasn't weak, he was resisting, that his fear was faith, that his silence was sacred, but it was a lie, not because the words weren't sincere, but because they offered no protection, no path forward, just a different kind of prison. By his late teens, Alexei was a living contradiction. To his father, a coward. To his mother, a symbol. To the church, a savior. To himself, a vessel too fragile to carry anyone's expectations. He was made to march at military drills, feet blistered, spine aching, surrounded by boys half his age, twice his will. He learned to assemble muskets, recite battle formations, cheer for victories he had no hand in. He watched men beaten for dissent and realized his soul would be next. Peter began speaking of disinheritance, not privately in court, in front of nobles, foreign envoys, military leaders. "My son is not a ruler," he said. "He is a monk in silk. Let him join the church. Let Russia have a man on the throne." Alexei stood beside him during those words, bowed as they were spoken. He did not cry, not then. But that night alone, he carved a cross into his palm with a letter opener and whispered a prayer with bleeding hands, "Deliver me, O Lord, from this crown." But God didn't answer, and Peter didn't stop. The court shifted. Nobles distanced themselves. Guards whispered. Ministers questioned. Even old allies began to wonder if the air was compromised. Alexei's name was used not with reverence, but with caution. His Grace the Unready, some called him, behind his back. To survive, he perfected the art of stillness. Never speak first, never speak last, never offer a thought that hasn't already been approved. He became what the empire wanted, a shadow of a man. But inside he was burning. He wanted out. Not the throne, not the fight, just out. But there was no door, no exit. Because a prince does not resign. He only disappears. Peter pushed harder, ordered public lashings in his presence, demanded he lead military parades despite his tremors, forced him to share meals with generals who mocked his voice. He endured, but endurance is not loyalty, it's postponement. At 20, Alexei was no longer a boy, but not yet free. He was a fuse burning at both ends, his father holding the match, his mother holding the myth. And when both began to tighten their grip, he made the only choice left. Don't rebel. Don't rule. Run. He didn't run to seize a throne. He ran to escape one. In 1717, Alexei disappeared from Russia under the guise of a religious pilgrimage. In truth, he was heading west toward Vienna, toward sanctuary, toward anything that wasn't his father. He thought exile might buy him freedom, or at least peace. But in monarchies, fugitives don't disappear, they're hunted. Peter was humiliated. His son, the imperial heir, had become a defector, a walking insult to the empire. Diplomats were dispatched, threats issued, promises made, and finally, a lie wrapped in velvet return. And you will be forgiven. Exhausted, homesick, desperate to believe the lie, Alexei came home. The moment his boots touched Russian soil, he was shackled. No embrace, no mercy, no ceremony, just a quiet arrest and a one-way escort to the Peter and Paul fortress, a place not built for justice but for obliteration. He was led through its iron gates under cover of night. No trial, no charges, just silence. And silence in Russia's most feared prison was a sentence. Interrogation began immediately. At first they asked, then they demanded, then they began to hurt him. He was stripped, beaten, and denied sleep. The candles were always dim, the walls never echoed. His body screamed, but the room stayed quiet. That was the horror of it, not the pain, but the absence of witness. No public, no priest, no mother, no voice. When he denied conspiracy, they escalated. Iron collars, heated tongs, thumbscrews, all under the pretense of enhanced questioning. Peter's trusted men watched, recorded, and smiled. This was not about discovering truth. It was about forcing a narrative that suited the Tsar. Alexei wasn't being broken for what he'd done, he was being broken so Peter could say, "This is why I destroyed him." At first, Alexei resisted. He wept. He pleaded. He prayed. Then he started confessing. Not to guilt, to survival. Yes, I conspired. Yes, I hated him. Yes, I wished the reforms undone. These weren't answers. They were surrender slips, signed in bruises and delirium. He was no longer speaking. He was echoing the voices of his torturers. Some say his screams startled the fortress ravens into flight. One night, as the guards rotated, he whispered to a jailer, "I am not fit to live. Let my Father's will be done." And that's when Peter made the final decision. He wouldn't sign an execution order. That would mean ownership, blood on the throne, a scandal. No, he wanted Alexei to vanish in a way that couldn't be traced, not with rope, not with blade, but with starvation. Meals were reduced, then skipped, then cut in half. The cell grew colder, the wounds festered, no medicine was given. He was told nothing, no sentence, no date, just the waiting. Starvation, unlike execution, doesn't declare itself. It hides. It pretends to be illness, exhaustion, melancholy. It kills without fanfare. It erases a man slowly enough that no one notices until it's done. Alexei began hallucinating, talking to figures that weren't there, whispering to icons carved into the damp walls. He begged for light, for water, for sound, for anything. What he got was silence and another day. His breath grew thin. His weight dropped below 100 pounds. He stopped bleeding because his body had nothing left to release. He defecated without control. His skin turned waxy. His bones protruded like scaffolding. He asked one guard to suffocate him with a pillow. He was not waiting for salvation. He was waiting to not wake up. And yet Peter waited longer, because to him this wasn't just death. It was purification, a cleansing of weakness from the royal bloodline. He wanted to watch his legacy survive starvation, not be questioned by it. On June 26, 1718, Alexei collapsed in his cell. His mouth foamed. His limbs trembled. He fell into a coma. He died hours later. No priest, no family, no dignity. The official report listed nervous fever. There was no mention of beatings. No mention of starvation, no autopsy, just a name scratched off a lineage chart. The empire moved on, but Russia did not forget. Not really, because beneath the myths and the medals, there's a darker truth etched into the bones of its rulers. Even a crown can become a weapon. Even a father can become a curse. And sometimes the loudest executions are the ones carried out in absolute silence. Starvation is not loud. It does not scream or crash or plead. It whispers, it numbs, it waits, and it always finishes what cruelty begins. In the final weeks of his life, Alexei Petrovich was no longer a prince, he was a silhouette, a shell of memory wrapped in skin too thin to heal. His body, once dressed in royal silk, now trembled under rags stiff with dried sweat and rot. His breath became shallow, a rhythmic fading in and out like a faulty candle. He could no longer stand without help. His feet swelled from infection. His mouth bled from ulcers. Guards described him as more shadow than man. The meals, if they could be called that, came irregularly. Mold-rimmed broth meat slick with decay crusts of bread so stale they cut his gums. No fresh water, no fruit, no medicine. Just enough to stay alive, never enough to recover. Because this wasn't negligence, it was strategy. The goal was not to kill him. The goal was to make his death deniable. No decree ordered his starvation, no signature, no witness, because that's what made it perfect. The system didn't murder him, his body simply failed. Or so they would say. By late June, his hair fell out in clumps. His skin, once pale, turned waxy gray. His fingers curled involuntarily from nerve collapse. His eyes sank into black hollows like windows into a mind already halfway gone. He muttered to no one, scratched the stone walls with trembling fingers. He began mistaking guards for saints, but no one stopped it. No one intervened, because this was not a tragedy. This was policy. Peter, far away from the cell, received updates not in cries, but in coded reports. Subject unable to rise. Nutrient refusal continues. Mental state deteriorating, like watching the final flickers of a candle he'd long since snuffed. He didn't want death. He wanted disappearance. On June 26, 1718, the flame went out. Alexei convulsed on the floor, foaming at the mouth, eyes wide but unseeing. His body spasmed once, twice, then collapsed. No priest, no prayer, just a guard standing in the corner silently marking the end of a problem. No royal physician, no autopsy, no justice. The official cause of death? Nervous fever due to exhaustion. There was no mention of beatings, no starvation, no screams, just bureaucratic silence. And in that silence, something far more terrifying happened. The empire erased him. His name was struck from succession charts. His portrait removed from palace walls. His tutors reassigned his friends, questioned his memory, scrubbed clean. There would be no state funeral, no mourning procession, no candlelit cathedral, just a quiet burial in a state he once would have ruled. Eudoxia, his mother, the architect of half his tragedy, said nothing. No letters, no public grief. Some say she wept in secret. Others say she smiled. But what's certain is this: she did not speak his name again. Because Alexei, in the end, wasn't a martyr. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't even a traitor. He was a warning. A prince who reminded the empire that blood alone doesn't protect. That obedience isn't enough. That mercy is not guaranteed even to those born behind marble walls. He died without legacy, without last words. His father outlived him. His country forgot him. And yet his absence echoed. In the years that followed, Peter would continue his reforms, expand his empire, build his monuments. But inside those stone palaces there remained one door never spoken of, the one behind which a son had disappeared, without a single drop of royal blood officially spilled. This wasn't justice. This wasn't punishment. This was a quiet execution designed to leave no stain. But history stains anyway. It seeps through cracks, clings to silence, waits for ears willing to listen. And if you listen now, past the victories, past the statues, past the propaganda, you might still hear him. A boy who begged not to rule, who asked only to live, and who was denied both. This is what tyranny looks like when it wears a crown. This is what power without accountability can do, not in front of a crowd, but in the dark, slowly, methodically, until nothing remains but a royal tomb with no name. Centuries have passed. The empire that crushed him is gone. The throne that denied him crumbled to dust. The man who starved him is remembered in textbooks as Peter the Great. But the boy, the one who died without a trial, without a grave worth visiting, without even the dignity of being mourned, he became a whisper in history. A loose thread quietly snipped and never acknowledged. But history does not forget. Not really. It waits. It waits for someone to ask the questions no monument dares answer. What happens when royalty is not privilege but prison? What happens when a father becomes more tyrant than parent? And what happens when the worst crime you can commit is not rebellion, but existing in the wrong way? Alexei Petrovich committed no treason. He did not raise an army. He did not incite a riot. He simply failed to become what his father demanded. And for that, he was erased. This wasn't a medieval tale. This wasn't a barbarian ritual from a lost world. This happened inside the palaces of one of the most enlightened rulers in European history. It was modern cruelty dressed in imperial robes, a murder without blood, a death without witness, a punishment too clean to name. Because when a father starves his son not from anger but from calculation, what part of us still believes in mercy? Peter never said the words. He didn't need to. He built the cell. He ordered the surveillance. He signed nothing. But his will was obeyed. And Alexei's body fulfilled what the Tsar could not speak aloud. This is why his death matters. Because it didn't happen in fire. It didn't happen in rage. It happened in silence, in bureaucracy, in shadows. And silence is how history repeats itself. Look closely and you'll see echoes. In every leader who values loyalty over life. In every government that sanitizes cruelty. In every parent who mistakes control for love. Alexei's story may be old, but its warning is urgent. Because power doesn't always scream. Sometimes it starves. And sometimes the most dangerous trait in an empire is to be too gentle to survive it. So here's the truth. Alexei Petrovich didn't die because he was a threat. He died because he didn't fight, because he believed being quiet would be enough, because he thought that obedience might protect him. But obedience is not armor, not when you were born into a throne shaped like a blade. And now we're left with the aftermath not of his life but of our forgetfulness. Because when stories like this are ignored, they vanish twice. First in history, then in memory. But you're still here, and that means something. If this story made you pause, if it made you question what power does when no one's watching, don't let it end in silence again. Comment below. Tell us what you think. Was Alexei a victim? A warning? A mirror saved this video. Because stories like this aren't told in classrooms. And if you want more truths that history tried to bury, subscribe. Because sometimes the darkest lessons are the ones that make us most human. Because in the end, maybe the real question isn't why Alexei died. Maybe the real question is, how many more like him have vanished? Just because their existence made power uncomfortable, and how many more will vanish if no one dares to ask why?